freedom is always one generation away from dying out, and it cannot be bequeathed like a beautiful old grandfather clock where you do a bit of maintenance and you call in the specialist to put oil on the gears, and it's not a piece of inheritance or, a 1 ounce gold nugget that just gets inherited from generation to generation, or a piece of jewelry. Freedom has to be relearned and appreciated by each new generation, and we have failed badly on that front in recent decades.
Welcome back to another episode of the Critical Compass. I'm James. This is my co-host, Mike. And today we've got a return guest. We've got John Carpay, president and founder of the JCCF, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. Welcome back, John. It's great to have you here.
Glad to be with you guys and with all your viewers and listeners.
Yeah, it's nice to have you back, but it feels like when we have you back, it's partially for a reason. It's because Canada's not in a good place. Is that an accurate assessment?
It's an understatement. There are so many problems, and you may have had a chance to see a video I put out about 3 weeks ago where I said Canada will be a police state by Christmas if Parliament passes bills C2, C8, and C9 in current form, along with the reintroduction of the Online Harms Act and the prior passage of the Online Streaming Act. You get those 5 pieces of legislation together, and we're going to be locking up or arresting thousands of people, like what's happening now in the United Kingdom, where if you have a salty or vociferously worded tweet denouncing immigration policies or something politically incorrect, you can get arrested, or almost as bad, you can get a policeman knocking on your door to give you a warning.
So yeah, that seems like that's the direction that we're going, especially if there's examples of how this kind of legislation can be overused in the UK. Could you maybe break down just a summary of what does each of these bills focus on, and then what's the problematic sections that we're actually concerned about?
Sure. Well, just do the tip of the iceberg. So the earlier piece passed about 2 years ago was the Online Streaming Act, and it gives the Canadian Radio, Telecommunications and Television, the CRTC, gives the CRTC authority over the internet in Canada to dictate Canadian content, to define what Canadian content is, and to monitor and regulate every podcast, every website for Canadian content. They haven't started to exercise that power yet, but the law is in place and they can do so. So that was a problem from 2 years ago. The problem was the passage of a bad law. Again, it hasn't yet been abused as far as I know. Then we have C2, which is the Strong Borders Act. I call it the Strong Surveillance Act. And while it does contain provisions to change our immigration and refugee policies and things pertaining to the border, it also has provisions to authorize Canada Post to search letter mail without a warrant. It bans the use of cash in amounts greater than $10,000 for donations to charity and for paying bills. It creates an Authorized Access to Information Act, which gives federal officials the power to search our computers and cell phones without a warrant. So that's really bad news. It's been denounced across the spectrum. There's so many different groups, academics, professors have denounced it, that the government's actually put it on the back burner, which is good, and it shows that activism does achieve some results. Again, just the tip of the iceberg, Bill C8 is the Cybersecurity Act, and it empowers the federal cabinet to kick individual Canadians off the internet without warning, without due process, if the cabinet minister decides that the individual constitutes a threat to Canada's telecommunication system. Now, in theory, that should only apply to hackers and fraudsters and foreign terrorists, domestic terrorists. But there's nothing in there to prevent a cabinet minister from kicking a Canadian off the internet because he doesn't like her social media posts, podcasts, website, etc. And if you are kicked off the internet, theoretically, you can go to court, but most Canadians don't have an extra $100,000 sitting around to use for litigation, a process that's going to take 2 or 3 years, at the end of which you might not even win. So the C8 Cybersecurity Act is very dangerous. It also gives the federal cabinet powers to search companies, to declare a company to be vital, to impose conditions on the company, to collect subscriber data and personal information about Canadians, et cetera, et cetera. Very, very broad-based, similar to the Bill C2, the Strong Borders Act, with this new Authorized Access to Information Act. It's all about warrantless searches. I can get into details on that. Bill C9 is the Combating Hate Act, and it authorizes judges to vastly increase punishments imposed on people convicted of crimes if the judge feels that the crime was motivated by hatred. It also removes a current sober second thought process whereby when local police, local Crown prosecutors in, Edmonton, Vancouver, Ottawa, Halifax, Montreal, local Crown prosecutors have to get the permission of the Attorney General of the province, the Justice Minister, to prosecute a Canadian for hate speech. And that kind of puts the brakes on it. That's why we haven't seen too many hate speech prosecutions in Canada. There might be 2, 3, 4 per decade. Maybe there's a bunch that don't get into the news, but they're so rare that they often do hit the news. They're going to get rid of that requirement that local police and local Crown prosecutors have to get the approval of the Justice Minister. They're scrapping that. And so it gives much more leeway. If a policeman feels that something is hateful, he can lay criminal charges. And even if the judge disagrees with a police officer and acquits you at the end of the day, you've now had criminal proceedings against you for the past 9 months or 18 months or 2.5 years. And so that's very menacing. If Bill C9 passes, we're going to see a lot more Canadians, I couldn't tell you what number, being prosecuted for hate speech. And hate cannot be defined because it's an emotion. Bill C9 tries to define hatred by saying that to ridicule someone, discredit, offend, hurt the feelings of somebody is not hate speech. Dislike and disdain are not hate speech. However, detestation and vilification are hate speech. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
You need a thesaurus to understand that.
Yeah. A good law, a just law by definition is clear. So when the criminal code says essentially thou shalt not kill, it's pretty clear. Unless you're insane, you know that you are killing somebody, intending to kill somebody. There's nothing gray about it. But how do you avoid a hate speech prosecution? And it's going to have a chilling effect whereby Canadians self-censor. Bill C9, the Combating Hate Act, is also very political because it bans the Nazi swastika, but does not ban the communist hammer and sickle, which many people, including many immigrants to Canada, would see that as a symbol of hatred towards business owners and aristocrats and all kinds of people. But you could wave around the communist hammer and sickle, the banner under which tens of millions of people were murdered by communist regimes in Russia, China, Cambodia, etc. You can wave that around, but not the Nazi swastika. So, maybe not a big deal, but I see the politics in it. And, if we're going to start banning one hateful symbol, we should ban more of them. And then fifth, last but not least, is the Online Harms Act, which died on the order paper when we had our election in April 2025. That bill would give new powers to the Canadian Human Rights Commission to prosecute Canadians for non-criminal, offensive, or discriminatory, another vague word, discriminatory speech. And people who support that love to say, oh, it's not criminal, therefore chill, relax, it's not a big deal. But if you're found guilty by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal of discriminatory speech, you can be fined up to $50,000, plus having to pay an additional up to $20,000 to the complainant whose feelings were hurt. The Online Harms Act also empowers judges to place you under house arrest, curfew, ankle bracelet, if your neighbor fears that you might commit a hate speech crime in future. Then without having been charged, without having been found guilty, you can actually have a judge restrict your freedom with house arrest or an ankle bracelet based on what you might do in future. So it's like Minority Report. It also empowers, this is the Online Streaming Act still, it empowers the federal cabinet to write all kinds of regulations governing the content of the internet without any parliamentary scrutiny. And then there'll be this brand new Digital Safety Commission, which will enforce those federal regulations. And there will be massive fines and penalties for companies that don't themselves start to remove content that they think is discriminatory. So the government can essentially get all the private companies to do their dirty work for them, because if you're a private company and you don't want to face, $1 million fines, you're going to hire your own censor to kick anybody off your social media platform or other platform. So Online Streaming Act already passed 2 years ago, C2, C8, C9, and then the potential return of the Online Streaming Act. You put those 5 things together and you've got a police state.
Mm-hmm. This summer in the UK, we saw a lot of Britons being arrested and actually face significant jail time for posts made on social media about comments related to the problem that the UK has right now with grooming gangs. Do you see this as like Canada's kind of follow-up attempt to enact similar legislation that allowed the UK to perform those acts this summer?
Sadly, yes. And to give you 2 examples of where Canada is at culturally, politically, legally, we've had Charlie Angus, I think he's now retired, but he was an NDP member of Parliament, put forward a proposal to make it illegal to speak positively about the oil and gas industry.
Yeah.
Now, it didn't get passed by the House of Commons and it was not adopted by the government, but the very fact that somebody would put this forward as a serious proposal. We had another NDP member of Parliament from Winnipeg said that residential school denialism, which could include saying that the residential schools experience was not necessarily bad for everybody, or challenging the unproven claim that there's 215 children buried at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. So she would actually, if it was within her power, she would criminalize the opinions, the incorrect opinions about Aboriginal residential schools. Now, David Suzuki is another example. He's not a member of Parliament, but he said that people who deny the forthcoming impending climate holocaust and who are not on board with him, that we need to, move ourselves into poverty by getting rid of oil and gas, that they should be jailed. They should be locked up and jailed for disagreeing with David Suzuki. So it's, again, those are private members' bills, but there's a lot of Canadians that think that you should be locked up for saying the wrong thing.
Well, I think that you touch on a huge point there, is that if these bills are not very clear, and if even the definition of hate is kind of nebulous and it's subject to the interpretation of the society, you'll have a cultural, whatever the dominant cultural force is at the time will be the one defining what that hate is. And currently that is a very leftist / neo-Marxist way of thinking, where if words are violence, well, harmers, words can be harm. There can be something as climate violence. Well, you're polluting, your CO2 emissions, that's a form of violence. You are threatening the world, and a threat must be met with some action to neutralize that threat. And you see how these word games sets up an overreach just by its very nature. And I feel like sometimes you have people, if not voting for it, they see some of these things and well, it won't be abused. It's kind of necessary. We need to protect our environment. We need to protect these vulnerable people. And it comes from a place of, I quote, like in quotations, it's compassion, but it's misplaced compassion. It's being weaponized by those who want to have more control over citizens.
Yeah, it's extremely dangerous, and I have to agree with what you just said. Another manifestation of that was the response to the political assassination and murder of Charlie Kirk, and he gets demonized by the CBC as being far right, in the words of the CBC, which is kind of anybody that disagrees with woke neo-Marxist perspective. So you could be a conservative, which is not far right. You could be a classical liberal, which is not far right. But, Charlie Kirk, because he's got these views, he's against abortion, he's in favor of free enterprise and small government, and, that's called far right. But more worrisome than that, and I mean, the CBC is not even, it's a taxpayer-funded advocacy group for big government and woke ideology. It's not even a media outlet in any meaningful way. But in addition to that, you've got university profs stating on the internet that, it's, I don't have the exact words, but, it's great that Charlie Kirk got assassinated. And they think it's great because they disagree really strongly with his message. There's a Manitoba cabinet minister who said publicly on Twitter that he's just a vile, hateful, blah, 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 complete denunciation. I have no sympathy for him. I do have sympathy for his children. I hope that they will grow up in a world that will be the opposite of what their father advocated for. It's a very nasty, vicious message.
Yeah.
And she was reprimanded by the Premier of Manitoba, and she issued a retraction apology. But again, it's a sign of where our culture is at, where you've got elected officials, in that case at least, and academics who are shaping our young minds are publicly proclaiming that it's a good thing to assassinate somebody who has the wrong ideas. That's scary.
It's very scary, and we've mentioned this before. We may have even mentioned it on our last show together, but we talk about how in modern politics now, the way that the left and the right view each other, and by and large, the right tends to view the left as maybe silly, gullible, maybe uninformed or ignorant or things like this, and whereas the left tends to view the right in terms of like biblical evil, and like
Evil.
how do you evil, yeah, and how do you engage in a conversation with somebody who you view as evil, and sort of to go on to James's point there, we've talked about in other contexts as well, like what would the reaction of somebody on the left be if it were a conservative government putting forward these bills? Would they still agree that government should enjoy all these powers to discern what is and isn't hateful? Because they would know that, of course, the definitions would be different depending on the parties that are in power.
Yeah. Well, when Stephen Harper's government tried to introduce restrictions, federal government restrictions on the internet or power over the internet, and I apologize, I forget the name of the bill, but the pretext, the justification that was trotted out was we got to crack down on child pornography, so we got to give all these broad powers to the federal government. And at one point, the justice minister, I don't know if it's Vic Taves or somebody else, said, either you're with us or you're with the child pornographers. And he thought he had a great soundbite, but it went over like a dead balloon. And there was so much pushback. And the opposition, the Liberals NDP bloc, were just howling about how outrageous and wrong it would be for the government to acquire more power over the internet. And now, some of the same people are with the 5 bills: online streaming, C2, C8, C9, and the Online Harms Act, which has not been reintroduced. But with those 5 bills, all of them are about government control of the internet. And they have to be seen together, because if you read your Bill C8 by itself, I was just going through it again today. If it was the only piece of legislation and the other 4 didn't exist, it wouldn't be necessarily a grave threat. But in combination with the other 4 bills, it's terrifying.
So, for example, you could see how this would be easily weaponized against a independent media outlet. Let's say they've got a few journalists. They have a network of people they get information from, etc. And if they can search, they can pull up all their emails. They can get their contact lists. If that can be done without a warrant, like you could say, well, they had an article that was hateful. Like, well, you already have some of that. There's enough there that they can somewhat justify a case. We're like, well, this is the law. We're just following the laws that exist, and we have to crack down on this hate, and this outlet's being hateful, and then they will use the tools that they have available if they are there. So one tool's like scary enough, but to have 4 or 5 different ways of potentially punishing speech or advocacy groups or media, like especially alternative media, it's going to be weaponized, especially when these conclusions, these opinions are contrary to the governing party. Now, the issue comes with people not seeing the bigger picture. And we try to do this on our show. We try to exactly flip the script and think about well, what would happen if somebody else was in power, or what would happen if this government did not share your views? Like, would the liberals be comfortable with any of this? Because as soon as you open this door, it's hard to roll these back. And you can draw parallels to well, there was a time there was no income tax, there's no GST, there's no this, no that. And we've opened the door to so many more, we're just offloading so much to the government. And then now it's seeming normal place. So I could foresee a time where if you have more of these bills and they've been around for 10 years, and maybe they haven't had a huge impact yet, and maybe they don't abuse it, but it's there in law, but it just seems normal. And it just seems like we have these just in case. It's not going to be undone easily. These things they're put in swiftly. And you're mentioning before that some of these are massive bills. They're hard to read, hard to understand. Seems like a lot of our MPs aren't even fully reading and understanding everything that's in there. So how prepared are we? How accountable is any of this right now?
Well, past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. So many management analysts and academics say, and I think it's true. It's not a perfect prediction. People sometimes do change their ways, but past behavior is the best indicator of future behavior. So the past and current behavior of governments in terms of media is that we are forced with our tax dollars to subsidize not only the CBC, which is funded entirely by taxpayers, but we also have to give huge sums of money to CTV and Global and the Globe and Mail, the National Post, every newspaper in Canada, most, if not all, radio stations that are kind of the more listened to, broader ones. And there's not a dime going towards, say, Ezra Levant's The Rebel or Juno News, True North, the Western Standard. These publications are not getting any money. And I think nobody should get any money, just to be clear. I'm not advocating that taxpayers be forced to contribute to The Rebel. But you can see this very clear bias where the government, by its actions, has very clearly said that there's a certain viewpoint that they will fund, and that's the mainstream viewpoint. So, the so-called mainstream media, they will refer to if you encourage a boy to take puberty blockers and estrogen and eventually, persuade him he could become a girl and get him castrated, they call that gender affirming care. That's the language used by the CBC. It's very biased. So, and on lockdowns and vaccine passports, the CBC, as well as all these other government-funded media, they rarely, if ever, interviewed anybody who said, Lockdowns are useless. You cannot stop the spread of the virus. The dangers of COVID have been exaggerated. Lockdowns are causing a lot of harm. Mandatory vaccination policies are a violation of the Nuremberg Code, which provides the idea of a fully informed, fully voluntary consent for any medical treatment. They didn't interview, with very few exceptions, they did not interview anybody who gave a contrary perspective. And now on Aboriginal issues, the media parrot the Kamloops Indian Band with their allegations that there's the bodies of 215 children buried there. There's not a shred of evidence to support that claim. The only way to find out is through an excavation. They've received $12 million to excavate. They haven't done it. And the media treated this like this was, truth. You look at the media coverage on the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, which was amazing that you had thousands of people in Ottawa over a period of weeks, and there's no cars set on fire, there's no shop windows smashed in, there's no violence, and yet the media get into this, these are dangerous white supremacist, neo-Nazi, racist criminals, and they're very dangerous, and the government's funding that message. So I could give you more examples, but if you see how the government's behaving in which media they're giving money to and which ones they're not, and when you hear politicians talking about the threat of disinformation and misinformation, as if they're not capable of putting out misinformation and disinformation, we got to combat misinformation. Well, it's pretty obvious what's going to happen when you give government all this power over the internet. It's very obvious.
Yeah. I wonder if this is maybe a little bit out there in philosophy land, but I wonder if you have a comment or any thoughts on, it seems to me that rather than being a left-right issue, as so many things we try to boil down to, it seems to me that this is an issue that's a byproduct of the type of person who is naturally most susceptible to propaganda, which tends to be emotional. It tends to be very, very surface level, instant sort of gut reaction type things. If you can scare somebody into, putting a mask on and, lining up for a unproven medical treatment. If you can do that to somebody, it actually doesn't really matter what their political opinion is. If the people who it's in the best interest of to distribute that propaganda can maintain control over them. So do you have any thoughts on that? Like, I don't even really know what I'm asking, but is there could you see, should the political winds shift a little bit, say Alberta, gains its independence, for example, that's a different discussion, but should, Poilievre's Conservatives, win the next election and maybe they win it in a majority fashion, can you see the same sorts of really socially destructive policies that we've been experiencing the last half decade here, just still happening and propagating throughout society, but maybe with a different angle to try and capitalize on whatever the social zeitgeist is of the moment?
Well, we saw it happen here in Alberta under Jason Kenney, who's supposedly small government, supposedly conservative. He once wrote a column a few years prior to the imposing lockdowns in Albertans where he said, we should listen to experts and glean from it and, take the nuggets and think about it. It's good that we have experts, but we can't put experts in charge of society and have a technocracy instead of democracy where these so-called experts are basically legislating. They replace the legislature, they replace democracy. We can't have that. And he was entirely correct. So this is a small C conservative guy that has been advocating for smaller government, religious freedom, locks up pastors in jail, and this is coming from back in the day. I don't know about today, but people. If you had asked people, well, is Jason Kenney a man of the left or a man of the right? Most people would say, well, he's a man of the right. He's not a man of the left, and took away all of our rights and freedoms. Mm-hmm. The governments with the name of conservative in Manitoba, in Ontario, in the Atlantic provinces. The Coalition Avenir Québec, supposedly a conservative party. So freedom is always one generation away from dying out. and it cannot be bequeathed like a beautiful old grandfather clock where you do a bit of maintenance and you call in the specialist to put oil on the gears, and it's not a piece of inheritance or, a 1 ounce gold nugget that just gets, inherited from generation to generation, or a piece of jewelry. Freedom has to be relearned and appreciated by each new generation, and we have failed badly on that front in recent decades.
Almost because things have been seemingly easy, we've been seemingly prosperous, we're seeing atrophy of this freedom muscle in a sense. Like it has to be something, it needs to be challenged. If there is no, not to say struggle, but if there's nothing that makes you aware of like how fragile some of these freedoms are, I feel like there's no push for people to be like, they're not double checking things. They're not really seeing how we could turn into like Soviet Russia, the kind of conditions, and we can find parallels. And it's often the people who came from the USSR and they left that are some of the first ones to speak up about some of these bills or some of the patterns. Their pattern recognition is finely tuned for that in a way that a lot of these, like our generation, were like, we didn't grow up with the same kind of, like these things feel a little bit farther away. World War II felt farther away, like the communist scare and all that, like feels like something you read rather than something that we experienced. So it's going to be lost.
Just to piggyback on that, we talked to a Polish couple this weekend at the I Am Alberta event, and they said they've been in Canada for, I think they said 10 or 15 years or something, around there, over a decade anyway. And they were like, we left this in Poland, like, and now we're seeing the last half decade here, we're seeing it feels exactly the same as the political environment that we left. And it's like, why? They wouldn't be the first Eastern European people I've talked to that have said the same thing. And it's like, why are we not listening to these people? Because they do have the radar for this, and they can see the signs before us soft Westerners can.
Yeah. Well, this is why we need to teach history in schools, but we've seen the near elimination of history as a subject at school. It's been transformed into social studies, and social studies has been the way my 15-year-old daughter described it not that long ago. Social studies is about learning that white people are bad. Yeah. And she said it tongue in cheek, like she saw through it as being ridiculous because, you're born with whatever skin color you're born with, and it's not something to be proud of or ashamed of. I mean, it is what it is. But see, if you teach history, then, even if our own country has not for the past 80 years suffered through the hardships of World War II. We had some suffering during the Korean War and the Vietnam War. We had Canadian soldiers that died in both of those wars. But if your own country hasn't been through a war, an occupation, state surveillance, people arrested and jailed for political reasons, even if you haven't experienced it in your own country, you can learn about it in other countries and you can have that awareness. But when somebody's ignorant of history, you can persuade that person of anything. And, we see democracies, there's so many examples. I mean, Spain had a democracy until 1936, and then war broke out and the fascists won the war. They didn't have elections for the next 40 plus years. They got their democracy back, but you had 40 years there. Chile had a functioning democracy with the peaceful transfer of power between government and opposition parties. In 1973, they have a coup. They get Pinochet in power for the next 17 years. There are so many examples. Germany had a functioning democracy prior to the Nazis winning power, but you had a situation in Germany where more than half of voters were voting for the two parties that promised to abolish democracy, namely the National Socialists and the Communists. Together, between the two of them, they got more than 50% of the vote. So even in a democracy, you can have the majority of voters actually voting to abolish democracy.
Yeah.
So it's something that, we need that in our culture where people believe that we have fundamental human rights that the government is not allowed to violate, and that these rights come from God, not from government. Because if rights come from, you don't need to be a Christian, Muslim, Hindu per se. You can believe in natural law, but that these rights don't come from government. Because if they do, then government naturally has every right to limit them as much as government deems best.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to say that too. I mean, it seems to me that there is sort of a, if you were to, I don't know, maybe put it on a graph or something, there is a pretty clear association between the as the secularism in a country rises, and the loss of what people tend to view as their like you say, your God-given rights or your natural rights or things like this. Because it's people tend to view rights as nowadays anyway, it seems like people tend to view rights as something that are conferred upon you by a government, rather than something that can only actually ever be limited by a government. Because it's part of what made, I've heard people talk about this as part of what makes the American Constitution so valuable, and that it describes your rights as being inalienable, which really, when you get down to it, meaning that not even you can give them up. Like, you don't actually even have the power to give up your own God-given right. And so that's a very powerful concept that people don't seem to really appreciate until it's threatened. So that's would you say that, I don't know if you're a religious man or not, but would you say that maybe we would do well as a society to get maybe a little bit more in touch with our traditional kind of roots like that?
Well, Ben Shapiro about 2 years ago was speaking at an event in Calgary, and he said, "I, as an Orthodox Jew, urge you all, go to church." So there's, I don't know if I see, like, the Justice Center's got, a lot of atheists and agnostics among our supporters, as well as people, we've got Jews and Christians and people of other religions. So it need not be a religion per se, but there has to be an appreciation there of our inherent human dignity, and that we're not farm animals.
Yeah.
And that's the thing about the totalitarians, about the Hitlers and the Stalins and the Maos. They see the people almost like a herd of cattle, to be herded about and told where to go and what to do, and castrated and inoculated, injected with vaccines, et cetera, et cetera. And, cattle don't have any rights, and it's the government that controls them. And they have a similar vision of their own people, that their people are like cattle that can be managed by the government, who is the farmer. And sometimes a good farmer can take good care of his, and in fact, a good farmer does take good care of his animals, but it's to serve the farmer's service.
A good shepherd,
it's
perhaps.
to serve the farmer's interests, because he's going to slaughter them at the end of the day and sell their meat.
Yeah, and the religious components I feel like, not that it's a proxy, but there's multiple factors. And I think one of the factors is that you mentioned cattle. I'm like, well, what have we seen? We've seen the institution of families weaken, the institution of churches, which act as a kind of it was part of the community, and you had that extension of the family through church and through communities. You had this glue that kept people together in a way that made them resistant to a lot of top-down control from a government, because they were navigating through their own communities rather than a self-imposed top-down version. And I think this goes hand in hand with, so you have more and more people not being religious, but you also have the departure from like the gold standard. We have a weakening of our currency. You have feminism saying that, well, it's the best thing for a woman to do is to get a job, and being a mother is oppressive. So now you have people moving away from home. You have less multi-generational homes. You have less of this like tight community of families that live within a couple kilometers. Now they're across the city. You're seeing less of your family members. You're kind of growing apart. You have more family members who might have wildly different views than you. And so we're almost very like, we're surrounded by people in the cities, but we are isolated in a way because these communities have broken down. So I'm seeing this a little bit more on the right of a push towards communities, and this sometimes is faith-based and sometimes it's just through the love of freedom or the love of, sometimes you have farmers still connecting on this way, or just like hunters, and there's still a push for the community. And I feel like some of these problems, I feel like that's an antidote anyways. And without that community piece, without that connection, people are just easily led by top down. They need that somewhere. And if you're not getting it from the bottom layer, then it comes from atop.
Absolutely. The weaker that marriages, families, and communities are, the stronger government gets. And we got a dose of this during lockdowns, where the government did, in fact, make it illegal for people to connect socially. And yet we need that human connection as much as we need water. The difference is, with water, after 3 or 4 days, you'll be dead. Whereas if you get cut off from community and from in-person social interactions, it's not going to kill you after 3 days, but it will, and it does harm your health. Prior to lockdowns, there was abundant, and there still is abundant medical literature showing that people who have in-person connections, whether, and it could be church, but it could be every Saturday night you're connecting with some good friends over beers at a pub, whatever the case might be. But people with more in-person connections, they enjoy better health and live longer lives than people who did not. And so, phones and Zoom calls can be wonderful substitutes, but we should have the new technologies as our servant, not our master. And what the governments did with lockdowns was really to weaken our mental health, spiritual health, by forcibly preventing us from connecting. Even at church, you couldn't have more than 15 people at church. BC shut them down entirely. So that's really important for a healthy society. For me, the big question that I wish I had an answer to is how can you reconcile urbanization with still maintaining strong communities? It seems to be in the nature of cities to have, 1 million people or even 100,000 people living fairly close together, but they're all isolated from each other. I don't know what the solution is to that, but that would be a really good, if somebody has a good solution for creating strong communities within large cities, that would be a really good thing.
There is even a push towards homeschooling or functional school units of like 15 kids. And that could be a vessel of community, or partially on the, like, ensuring that, like, well, these kids are learning something it's not just neo-Marxist depression history. Like they're learning actual practical things, and or like, what's the cost of,
including how to read and write?
Yeah,
and think.
Maybe a little bit
What
of
a
adding,
concept,
maybe a little bit of arithmetic. But so that could be one vessel of community as well. Sorry to interrupt you, Mike. So
No, that's okay. I was just going to say there's a, one thing that certainly won't do it is by disseminating through the, from the prime minister, no less, that the idea that Canada is a post-national state, that we don't have any national identity. That's no way to build communities. In fact, that's a way to specifically break up communities. And actually, I don't know if you're familiar with this. There was I don't know if it was necessarily a study or if it was just an observation that was done at Amazon warehouses. And they found that the Amazon warehouses that had the highest, that had the greatest mix of different cultures, races, male, female split, like the most mixed
Diverse.
up ones, Yeah, the most diverse ones, were the least likely to attempt to unionize versus ones that were Amazon warehouses that were based in more homogenous communities. And so I think that idea is not lost on those who would seek to control us, that the more you can diversify a community, the more you can keep people occupied with thinking about the differences between their cultures, and maybe even, if you're lucky, fighting about it and complaining about shit that doesn't matter, instead of actually focusing their efforts on combating the people who are actually attempting to oppress you with bills like C2 and C8 and C9.
And I do have a question for you on that, and that brings up a good point. You mentioned unions, and a union being an organization to help protect people from corruption, more so at a government level, or that kind of organization. Exploitation, yeah. I'm wondering, and we're seeing this in Alberta right now, what is protecting union members from the corruption of a union? Do you need another union? Like, do you just keep on going down? You keep...
It's unions all the way down, John.
It's because the case, like right in Alberta right now, it feels like it's kind of a messy situation. It feels like the union's more of a political arm, and this ties in directly with these bills that are coming out. Feel like very political in nature, but it also seems like what's happening in Alberta with the teacher strike is also just an extension, mostly of the NDP party. It feels like it's driven by a little bit of a hatred towards the UCP. Do you feel like the union, the Teachers Association, do you feel like they are acting in good faith as a union? Or is there any evidence to show otherwise?
Well, specifically on the current teacher strike, I heard a interesting and sad story from a teacher a few months ago in the summer. Calgary school teacher. I think she's in a Catholic school. She says 1/5 of her class is one or more of the following: they can't speak English, they are mentally challenged, they have a severe learning disability, they're a severe behavior problem, possibly have a very toxic home environment, which obviously contributes to kids misbehaving at school. And so 1/5 of the class has got one or more of those: can't learn, can't speak English, behavior problem, acting up, acting out. And she said there's no learning, very little learning going on in the class. And it's already hard to teach a class when you have, if you have 30 students and they can all speak English and none of them have significant learning disabilities. It's already difficult to try to teach math or English in a one-size-fits-all kind of a way. That's already challenging. Add to that 1/5 of the class that is not even able to grasp what most or all of the other 80% is capable of learning at various speeds, at various levels. So I'm saddened by the teacher strike because it's so superficial. It seems like they're just arguing about money when you've got, we could do so much with the same amount of money. If you gave every parent a grant, like let's say currently, and I once heard, and this might be out of date, it's probably higher now, but the Alberta government was spending $10,000 per child per year in the publicly funded public schools and Catholic schools, $10,000 per child per year. If you gave a certificate for $10,000 or a voucher or a credit or there's ways of doing it. If you gave every parent the $10,000 to spend on their own child's education, you're going to see a flourishing of all kinds of different schools. There might be one or two schools that, they're going to promote transgender ideology. They're going to tell little 5-year-old Johnny in kindergarten that he might be a girl. You might see a little bit of that. Maybe there's some parents that want that. Okay, well, you can use your $10,000 for that kind of a school. But you're going to get some schools will emphasize sports, others will emphasize music, others will emphasize a religion, others will emphasize a language, others will emphasize a more classical curriculum. And you're just going to get, who needs the ATA in that context? The whole union thing just disappears. But unfortunately, even though I think the government in some ways tries to innovate, wants to be innovative, they're really stuck in their thinking. They're boxed in. They're not thinking outside the box. Daniel Smith announced 2 or 3 years ago there was going to be X number of billions to build a whole bunch of more brick and mortar schools. But these schools are not. They're doing a poor job, right? And I think, we do need some spaces. But if you gave $10,000 to every parent and let the parents spend that money. Most parents, they're not going to homeschool. They want to be working, doing this or that. Most parents are going to send their kids to school, but you're going to get all kinds of schools and there'll be direct accountability. And if a school is performing poorly, parents are not going to send their kids there. They're going to be upset. They're going to look for another kind of school. So you get a real accountability there that currently does not exist.
Yeah, my wife was a teacher for some years, and she knew quite a few people who had gone, quite a few teachers actually, who had gotten disillusioned with the Alberta, the Edmonton Public School Board anyway, and had kind of gone off on their own and they'd work at charter schools or they did tutoring and things like this. And when you talk to those people, you realize very quickly that actually, at least for primary grade, 1 through 5 or 6 education, really, at the end of the day, there's only about an hour and a half or 2 hours of actual instructional material time to have a successful, like you can complete, like a grade 1 or a 2 or a 3 student can complete their education in a couple of months, really, of like dedicated daily, 1 or 2 hours a day. And the rest of the time is filler. And the rest of the time is, sit down, you can't go to the bathroom, stop yelling, don't move over there, stop throwing your like this. It's not it's a glorified daycare essentially now with how many behaviors there are out there, because you can any number of factors, but really there is the more that people start to catch on to that, and the more they realize how poorly optimized the public school system is to what their kids could be achieving. You hear the argument about, well, they get invaluable socializing time and stuff. Well, actually not really, because that socializing is actually fairly toxic and can actually kind of be dangerous depending on the situation. Nothing of which wouldn't be very easily substituted with a couple extracurriculars, a sport and a martial art or a music class, something like this. So yeah, it's a very inefficient system. And I think you're sort of seeing. Well, I think what we're seeing now, at least from the union, is sort of the dying gasps of an institution that sort of sees its future in the AI revolution as sort of they're in the dusk of their relevancy. I don't know. That may be just me, but
well, and this is also existing at the same time as the book ban that the UCP put in place, and is that the UCP trampling on the rights of kids, of teachers, because people will frame that as they wrongly say that the UCP created a list of banned books and it included Atlas Shrugged and some others, where the reality is that they got complaints from teachers that Blankets and Genderqueer and some books with some graphic novels were accessible and found in the backpacks of some very young kids. And these teachers had no clue that these materials were available. So the teachers asked the government to step in because the public schools were not self-policing and creating age-appropriate curriculums. So I guess in this case, what is the government's role in setting out like guidelines for explicit material in that sense? Is this an overreach, or is this within the acceptable bounds?
Well, children don't have charter rights. So when a related topic, and I will talk about the books in the kids' libraries, but when Danielle Smith, I think it was getting on close to 2 years ago. I know it was in January. I don't know if it's January 2025 or earlier. In any event, she announced that the Alberta government would insist that on parents being informed about their child's transgender journey, which typically starts with a boy starting to wear girls' clothes and use a girl's name and use a girl's bathroom. That's kind of the starting point, and then it moves into puberty blockers and opposite sex hormones, and then it moves into castrations and mastectomies eventually, et cetera, et cetera. And so the government quite wisely, quite appropriately said that parents have a right to be informed. And the government also recognized that you're too young to make these irreversible, life-altering decisions. You should not be allowed at the age of 12 or 14 or 16 to make, for a girl to make decisions to take testosterone and grow facial hair and acquire a deep voice and render herself permanently unable to bear children, or for a boy to take the estrogen and never become a father of his own children. You're way too young. We require the consent of parents for a tattoo, for crying out loud. We require signed consent for a teacher to give an aspirin to a kid with a headache. We require signed consent for a school field trip. And yet somehow the whole transgender journey, parents should be kept in the dark. So it was a wise policy, and it was in line with what's the United Kingdom, Sweden, Norway, countries all over the world are backing away, except Canada, not yet, from this whole transgender ideology. So there's a gay rights group, AGAL, took this to court and got a court injunction against it. And their argument is that somehow, and they don't word it this way, so I'm paraphrasing it, but children have a charter right to keep their own parents in the dark about their journey towards becoming the opposite sex. And it's ridiculous. Children don't have charter rights. They can't vote. They can't drive before the age of 16, et cetera, et cetera. We've got these rules in place. Why? Because children are not adults. They need to be loved and nurtured and guided and cared for and protected by their parents, or, if the parents are not there, by legal guardians. So now back to the schools thing, children don't have some sort of a charter right to read whatever they want. If you don't have a voucher system or a grant system where every parent gets $10,000 and they can spend it in the way that they deem best, if we don't have that kind of a sensible system, if it is going to be brick and mortar, and if it is going to be ultimately run by the government, then in that context, yeah, the government has legitimate authority to decide what children will or will not read, and it's entirely appropriate and not censorship in the same way that it would be if the federal parliament passes bills C2, C8, C9 and starts to censor what we can see and hear on the internet. It's not censorship to prohibit children from getting exposed to certain books.
Yeah, that's maybe just I'll make one final comment on that, and then I'll ask you just to kind of, we'll circle back. That censorship argument is it boils my blood when I see it, because I see people who should know better, adults, online talking about this, and it's like there is no one in the government who is going to Chapters or Indigo and saying you can't carry these books in your store. No one's preventing you from buying these books, these filth for your children in a private context. It's a completely different context when you're talking about a publicly funded school. So thank you for saying that. Maybe just to kind of circle back again to Bill C2, 8 and 9. In your opinion, maybe, I don't know, this has been a depressing one, a good one, but a depressing one, John. So do you have any sort of, what can an average citizen do to kind of combat these, to sort of have their voice heard, or to have, like, what tools would you equip the average citizen, maybe the viewer of our show, to have to start the kind of conversations necessary to prevent these bills from going unopposed in our government?
The long-term solution is to change our culture so that Canadians understand with their minds and appreciate their hearts what our rights and freedoms are, and appreciate that government should be our servant to carry out certain tasks, but government should not be our master who tells us what to think and what to believe and how to live. So the cultural change is the long-term solution, because to the extent that that's achieved, it will trickle up into the police forces, the Crown prosecutors, the lawyers, the judges, the law societies, the medical establishment, the legal establishment, the universities, etc. So that's long-term. Short-term, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. And there's an awful lot of Canadians who love truth, love justice, love freedom, been completely disengaged from being involved in the democratic process. They don't pay attention to school board elections. They don't run as a candidate. They're not involved in provincial, federal, municipal politics. And the way democracy works is that the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And if you are very active, you tend to get your way, not 100% of the time. And the more active you are, the more that you tend to get your way. And there's a lot of good people who love truth, they love freedom, they love justice, and they're just not engaged. And there's a lie out there that it makes no difference, and that's false. I mean, we see here in Alberta, we used to have a premier named Jason Kenney, who was removed by Albertans who got engaged in the democratic process. They took out a membership in his party. They voted against him in a leadership review, and he was forced to resign. Why? Because there were thousands, I think it was thousands, not just hundreds, there were thousands of Albertans who joined a political party to get busy. And it was a beautiful thing to see. It was wonderful to see this tyrant and human rights violator removed from office. And yet people will whine about, oh, my school board's dominated by a bunch of blue-haired, woke transgender activists, and they want to, force everybody to wave the rainbow flag, and we're just victims here. And the truth is, no, you're not a victim. Roll up your sleeves, get to work, and replace those people with parents who are going to make sure that their kids are not exposed to garbage in the schools. Now, that takes a lot of thankless, hard work, for which in most cases you're not going to get any recognition or applause. And that's just the nature of democracy. We've got to roll up our sleeves and be far more involved than what we have been. So that's a short-term solution. Long-term solution is cultural change.
And regardless of what direction things go in, if people are more engaged, that's just going to bring more accountability, because then more things bubble up to the surface. You're aware of it. It's being talked about. I think we're seeing this a little bit in the Alberta independence movement. Is partially what's fueling that is people stepping up and they're making a stand. They're speaking their minds. They're pushing this forward. I do hear from some people, they're like, oh yeah, I want Alberta to be independent. And they're like, yeah, I don't really feel like driving out to this thing. And you're like, well, if you're going to build a country, it's going to take some work. There are going to be some uncertainties. Let it be like fixing Canada or Alberta going its own way. It's not going to be easy. It's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of hard work. There might be some difficult moments. But if it's truly worth it, then like I see no other choice for people if they truly believe that. I did have one last question though about just on the topic of independence and the pathway, the legal pathway there. We mentioned last time the 1998 reference, the Supreme Court decision, which the Clarity Act is the federal interpretation of that decision. We hear often from people saying that Alberta cannot separate because they will not get enough votes to change the Constitution. They say that, well, the Clarity Act opens, both the Supreme Court decision, it mandates good faith negotiations, but they're saying, well, what if 7 provinces don't agree to change the Constitution? You would need to change the Constitution if Alberta was leaving. So does this apply differently? Does the principle of the democratic will, is that more important? Like that expression is more important than that process that is normally kind of reserved for amendments to the existing framework? Like how does that work?
Well, the Supreme Court of Canada released its reference re Quebec secession in 1998, as you mentioned. At that time, the Supreme Court justices were fully aware of the fact that generally changing Canada's constitution requires the consent of the federal parliament and 7 provincial legislatures of 7 provinces, which together represent more than 50% of Canada. So that's our amending formula. 7 provinces plus the federal government, and I believe it has to be done within a time period of 5 years. And so if you wanted to remove Section 33, the notwithstanding clause from the Charter, for example, that could be done by majority vote of federal parliament and majority votes in 7 provincial legislatures. And you could say, okay, we're going to get rid of the notwithstanding clause. That's a general approach. The Supreme Court of Canada was fully aware of that when they issued their ruling, in which they said a province, if the majority of the people that vote in a referendum in a province vote to leave Canada, neither the federal government nor the other 9 provinces can force that province to stay. Now, they did say that about Quebec, but there's nothing in that ruling that does not apply to Alberta. So if there's a referendum, it has to be a clear question. Like, do you want to leave Canada? Do you want Alberta to cease to be a province of Canada and become an independent country? I mean, there's probably a half dozen ways that are clear, okay? If it's a clear question and the majority of voters in a referendum vote yes to leave, then the rest of Canada, primarily the federal government, but I'm sure they would consult with the other 9 premiers, the rest of Canada has to negotiate. And yeah, the negotiations would be a lot of hard work, but, Slovakia separated from Czechoslovakia, and I'm sure there's, lots of hard work involved to negotiate all these various details. The Czechs probably had military bases in Slovakia, this and that. They had to negotiate that. When Norway separated from Sweden, they used to be one country together. There's just so many examples. So it is definitely a lot of hard work, but where there's a will, there's a way. And the moment that more than half of Alberta voters vote to leave, then those negotiations are going to get started, and Alberta can become an independent country.
Fantastic. John, is there, or just want to be respectful of your time, is there anything that we didn't ask you or didn't talk about today that you wish that we would have?
Just briefly, the World Health Organization, international health regulations, the World Health Organization deems them to have come into force as of September, 2 months ago. And these are regulations that Canada is very enthusiastic about, and it would empower the Director General of the World Health Organization to declare a pandemic emergency and to order every country in the world to lock down their citizens, impose travel restrictions, pressure people into getting injected with whatever, a safe and effective substance is being peddled at that time, et cetera, et cetera. The only holdouts as of right now are the United States, Italy, Israel, and Argentina. Those 4, for various reasons, are not going along with it. But I find it amusing that the same people who, if they hear U.S. President Donald Trump talk about Canada being a 51st state, which would obviously violate Canadian sovereignty, right? And they get very upset about that. And these same people are saying we should give up our sovereignty to unelected bureaucrats in Geneva, Switzerland. So one more thing you can contact your member of parliament about and say, protect Canadian sovereignty. We don't want to be governed by unelected, unaccountable World Health Organization bureaucrats in Geneva. And now the silver lining on that cloud is that the World Health Organization has no police force, no army, no courts to issue rulings. And so if 3 months from now, 3 years from now, 13 years from now, if the Director General declares a pandemic emergency and orders the whole world to violate human rights through lockdowns, it'll be up to the government of the day, whichever people are in power in the 200 countries of the world, it'll be up to them whether to comply or not comply with those regulations, because the WHO has no army to enforce it. Nevertheless, people should contact their MP about that.
And one last note on the contacting your MP. Depending on what matter this is about, sometimes it's good to also contact the minister, which falls under that domain, and or the shadow minister as well, because sometimes the minister is not really on board with what you're saying. You're technically giving a voice or giving ammo to the shadow minister to paint a case and provide some opposition. So those are just some tips.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we just one more thing, some good news. There was so much outcry against Bill C-2, and it came from across the political spectrum. You had, Canadian Civil Liberties Association, not what you would call a right-wing group. You had this Michael Geist, a very respected law professor at the University of Ottawa, who also, he would be offended if you called him a conservative or a right-winger. But there's people across the spectrum, and the Justice Centre and all of our supporters. There's so much outcry against Bill C-2 that the federal government still wants to push it through, but they've actually taken out the immigration and refugee and border parts of Bill C-2, put it into a separate bill, C-12, for fast tracking. And I think they're hoping to get the support of the Conservatives, and they probably will. So they're fast tracking C-12. And then that still leaves C-2 as a bad piece of legislation, but they've put it on the back burner because there's been so much opposition. And MPs of all parties have heard that, and Liberal MPs have heard from their own constituents that C-2 is bad news for freedom and for privacy. And so, yeah, contact your MP, and that's what's going to make a difference.
Mr. John Carpay, where can people find you online, and do you have any events or speaking engagements coming up?
We've got, for your Ottawa listeners, on Thursday the 30th, we have our Celebrating Victories for Freedom event in Ottawa. You can buy tickets at www.JCCF, Justice Centre Constitutional Freedoms, jccf.ca. And if you're not in Ottawa, still go to the same website. You can sign up for an email newsletter. And if you want to donate, we get 100% of our funding comes from voluntary donations. We're a registered charity. We issue official tax receipts in February. So if you'd like to make a donation online, www.jccf.ca, or if you want to mail in a check, we've got our snail mail address on the website as well. And if you don't want to donate, if you just want more information, go to our website and sign up for our email newsletter.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, sir. We'll link to all those below. Always appreciate your time. You're a absolute font of knowledge. So thank you for sharing with us and our listeners, and we're looking forward to the next one.
It's great to have you on.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Thanks, sir. Okay, we'll chat soon. Cheers.